A landmark hearing on sex work is taking place in Ontario's Superior Court this week. Advocates want sex work to be fully decriminalized in Canada. On Monday, a coalition of sex workers and advocacy groups began presenting their arguments. They say sex workers are in a position of danger and the current laws leave them vulnerable to being harmed and exploited. That includes forced isolation, a higher risk of eviction, and not being able to speak openly with their clients about issues that affect their safety. My next guest is part of one of the groups advocating for that decriminalization of sex work. Jelena Vermilion is a sex worker herself and the executive director of Sex Workers Action Program Hamilton. That group is part of the Canadian Alliance for Sex Work Law Reform. That includes 25 groups across the country. They're among the plaintiffs in this lawsuit. Hi, Jelena. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, Ginella. I appreciate it.
Jelena, tell us a little bit about, we heard there the argument that the current law harms sex workers, and we heard some of the examples there. Can you just tell us a bit more about what, some of the safety issues are and how decriminalization would help create a safer environment?
Absolutely. So first and foremost, this is a constitutional challenge. So the lawsuit is claiming that the current laws, PCEPA or Bill C-36, violate multiple sections of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Human Rights and Freedoms for sex workers, including Section 7, right to liberty, life, and security, Section 15, right to equality and non-discrimination, as well as Section 2B, right to freedom of expression, and Section 2D, freedom of association. So some of the harms that are caused by these laws makes it really difficult for sex workers to communicate about the terms, the prices, the actual sexual acts that are going to occur during an appointment with a client when communicating for the purposes of sexual or providing sexual services is a crime under the current regime. That's just one example. Another example is for street-based sex workers specifically, because they often try to avoid police detection. They're going to quickly get into a car of a prospective client, which often puts them in a vulnerable position where they haven't pre-negotiated the terms, as I aforementioned, in terms of services, what acts they're going to engage in, and then they're stuck in the car of a potential aggressor, right? But where we were in a decriminalized context, for example, in New Zealand, there's many examples in the media in the last decade that show sex workers who have a client that don't pay. They're able to contact the police because they're no longer considered criminals. They're no longer in conflict with the law doing their work, and they're able to contact the police. And there have been many examples where sex workers have the police intervene in that case of a client not paying. The police actually say, pay the sex worker or we will charge you with extortion. So when you remove the criminal law, you remove the conflict of the law for sex workers engaging with police. So it also strengthens and helps to rebuild and repair a lot of those broken relationships over the years between police and sex workers, who often both have...
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. Who often both have a lot of information about their communities.
Can you also just talk about maybe some of the misconceptions around sex work that maybe derails the conversation around decriminalization?
For sure. So often people conflate sex work with trafficking, and often people don't understand that human trafficking is certainly an issue, but the problem of this particular obfuscation, or the way that it confuses people on purpose, is that it removes the aspect that this is a human rights issue. People who are trafficked can be dealt with in the law without criminalizing sex work. If you remove the sex work laws, the laws that of general application that currently exist in the criminal code, such as for kidnapping, rape, extortion, all of these other things, still remain. Those mechanisms still remain for those predators to be prosecuted and convicted, hopefully, in the system. So removing sex work laws does not hurt people who have been trafficked, and often people who have been trafficked are harmed by the sex work laws because they are thrown into the same category as people who are helpless victims, and they aren't provided agency in how they seek services or are provided quote unquote rescue. So another misconception is that sex workers are all in danger because of the work. No, the work itself, I've been doing sex work for about a decade, and I've had very few instances where there have been violence, and if there were any, I was able to mitigate them just by advocating for myself, but that's not the case with everyone. So the point being that the criminal laws right now make vulnerable and foster situations of exploitation and violence for sex workers. We need to remove those criminal laws so that, for example, we could ask for a client to provide us their ID, their license, before we have an appointment, because they're not going to be afraid of being charged for purchasing sexual services as a crime if those laws were removed. We would be a lot more safe, and the clients know right now what the criminal atmosphere is like in the law, right? So if we're able to remove those laws, it would increase the safety for sex workers, because clients who would not act with impunity or pretend like they could act with impunity. Some people target sex workers specifically because of stigma and because of the criminal law. They know that we are between a rock and a hard place, because the government believes that it's protecting women and girls and gender equality by criminalizing sex work and with a view to abolishing it. But ultimately what it does is harm many marginalized people who are in the sex trade industry, including Black, Indigenous, and Asian women, migrant workers, women living with disabilities, trans women living with HIV, etc. We have many marginalized people and non-binary folks who are in the industry that are continually harmed by these laws, and will continue to be harmed by these laws if they're not repealed.
As we heard, 5 days of hearings this week, and so we will see how the Superior Court will rule. Jelena Vermilion is a sex worker and the Executive Director of Sex Workers Action Program in Hamilton tonight. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you very much. Have a great night, Ginella.